I'm Kathryn Kidder. Today is July 22nd, 2020, and I'm here with Liz Shaw. Liz, would you please say your full name, including what maiden name, and spell them?
Elizabeth Todd Shaw, Elizabeth, Todd, Todd, Shaw, Shaw.
Thank you. We are here to talk about the Agricultural Women's Club, a group that is affiliated with the University of Florida, founded in 1908 and disbanded this year. But first, we'd like to know a little bit more about you. And I, first of all, thank you for agreeing to do this oral history interview. So where and when were you born?
I was born in Easton, Maine in 1937. I was born at home, and my mother's doctor was Dr. Storer Boone, Boone. I was my parents' first child, and they could not decide on a name for me. I think it was because there was this problem of, do we name it the child after her mother's mother or her father's mother? And neither of those names were too appealing. There was Effie for one and Bertha for the other. And so when Dr. Boone came back about the third or the fourth day, he said, if you don't have a name for that child, by the next time I come, I'm going to name her. And so when he came, they still did not have a name. And so he named me Elizabeth after his mother because I was born on her birthday. And so this was our family doctor. And of course, we had a long association. I mean, Dr. Boone was more than just my regular doctor. He was that extra special person who remembered me on graduation day when I got married, and came to see when my father died, the funeral. And so there was a lifetime of connections there.
That's wonderful. What were your parents' names?
My mother was Helen Dane, Dane, Todd. Her middle name is her maiden name. But when you go back in history, you'll find that sometimes that was spelled as Dean. But my grandfather had a half-brother who was also named George. And so my grandfather changed his spelling and became George Dane in order to distinguish himself from George Dean, who lived in the same town and was his half-brother. So, when you go to trace connections and family history lines, it can be compromised in many ways. My father's name was Guy Durwood Todd. The middle name Durward, we never have understood where my grandmother found that name. We think she was reading a novel and came up with that name. But anyway, he was G.D. Todd. And essentially my brother also was G.D. Todd because his name was George Dane Todd, named after my mother's father. And so there was always G.D. Todd. And on the potato barrels, I grew up on a farm in the Aroostook County of Maine. And so you always painted your initials on the potato barrels so that when you took your potatoes to the station and deposited them, you could identify your barrels. So there was always GDT on all the barrels everywhere.
Was your family originally from that area, all your parents and grandparents?
All my parents and grandparents came from Canada, and that originally most of them. And again, that's a complicated story, of course. But essentially, my grandfather, Dane, immigrated. Essentially, the paper said Ireland. But one never knows, because one would go from Scotland to Ireland to get a boat to Canada. And so they all, on that side of the family, they came into a town called Beardsville, New Brunswick. And that was just on the other side of Easton. And so my grandfather, about 1880, moseyed over the line. I mean, there wasn't much distinction back then, because Aroostook County in the northern part of Maine was very isolated. We felt more akin to Canada than we did to New England, because between Bangor, which was the major town in the central part of Maine, there was 100 miles of woods. And so there wasn't much that went on back and forth. And so, the county, Holton, which was the oldest town in the county, it had been settled because the immigrants to that town came over from Fredericton, New Brunswick. And so really the whole area that I was in were English and Scottish immigrants who moved simply over to Maine from New Brunswick, Canada. About 60 miles north of me, there were the French Canadians who moved over to the northern part of Maine. And so, of course, they spoke French. And so we had this distinction in Aroostook County of a small, it's a very large county land-wise, but very small in population. And so essentially we had the French-speaking area and we had the English-speaking area.
Very interesting history. So did you spend your whole childhood in Aroostook County?
Yes, I did, because my father was a farmer. And so our trips outside of Aroostook were very limited. My father had to travel to Boston frequently when I was a small child because he had arthritis, and he had been treated with the gold treatment, which was supposed to cure the problem of arthritis. But the nurse, unfortunately, who gave it to him, gave twice as much as she should have. And so there were repercussions that way. And so he had to frequently go back to Boston for treatment. But he persevered. And although he was troubled with arthritis all his life, he farmed. And when he married my mother's parents had a farm. And so those were combined. So that gave him extra land too. They started out living in my father's parents' home, and that was fine. But then, of course, you get a younger brother who feels he's being abused by the in-laws that he has. And so my father and mother gave up that home and they bought another one closer to town. The younger brother moved back to the grandparents, to be my grandparents' home. And so there's always a lot of coming and going that way, which is really amusing when you get a little farther along in life and look back. Oh, dear.
What was your home like?
Well, it was built at the turn of the century, 1905. And so it was a very elaborate house with a steeple on it. It was a Queen Anne style of house, essentially. And so we had bay windows in that we had a den, a living room, and a parlor. And each of those rooms had bay windows that were the width of the room. So it made very nice, large rooms that way. In the summertime, we more or less lived in the den because it faced south. And then in the wintertime, we'd move into the living room because that's where the fireplace was. And then most of the time we had the parlor and the living room joined together because there were sliding doors there. And so you could just have one huge room that way, essentially. And of course, at Christmas time, the Christmas tree went up in the parlor, and the piano was in the parlor. And so when you had to lay out the dead, they came and were laid out in the parlor. And so, that was New England style of life. And the house was joined to the barn with one of those long wood sheds, because we had a wood, just to begin with, we had a wood stove, and we had we burned wood in the furnace also, which heated the house. We had hot water heat throughout the house in that we had large radiators, and they were all heated by this furnace in the basement. And so between the barn and the house, there was this long, it would be like a shed, or it had a porch on it. We used to hang our clothes in the wintertime on lines that we had on that porch. Of course, they would freeze before they really dried, but eventually the water did evaporate from that. And so we would hang that. And then upstairs over the woodshed, there was a place where you could stack things that you weren't using. And so that was my and my brother's source of enjoyment on rainy days or cold days, because we could go up there, and the man who had built the house, William H. Dillon, he had left behind, trunks full of letters and things that were of rather interest. He and a lot of other young men from that area of the country had gone west in about 1880. I mean, he was born, I think, in 1860. And so, 20-year-olds, when they got to be 20 years, they were all anxious to go west and find their fortune. And so they went to Kansas City. They worked in slaughterhouses. They worked in all kinds of places. And so he saved every letter that his parents or his brother wrote to him. And so they were all there. And then there were letters like from a young lady from Kansas City who sent him a letter with the first rose of summer that she had picked for him. Obviously, she was sweet on him, but he, of course, returned to Maine and to a sweetheart that lived across the road from him. And so the girl from Kansas City didn't get William Dillon that way for a husband. There were two others in his family. His sister, who worked in Boston and who came home eventually after she had retired, and another brother who became a medical doctor and served in Easton as a medical doctor for quite a few years. Henry Dillon also served as a selectman on the board for the town of Easton. Our form of government, we would always elect 3 selectmen. And so when things from the town office became out of date and obscure and not necessary, he wouldn't throw them away. He'd bring them back to his house and leave them in a trunk. And so I found, I brought a lot of this collection with me to Florida. And so a few years ago, I went through it, and there was really an interesting story about the time that the selectmen ordered a hearse, not a new hearse, but a used hearse from a company in Massachusetts. And they wrote back and forth with this man in Massachusetts who had, contacts throughout the state of Maine for delivering hearses that were pulled by a horse. And this was like just at the turn of the century, about 1901 or so, 1902. And so eventually the people in Boston shipped this hearse to Easton for their approval. Didn't ask any money in advance. I mean, amazing, you know. It came, well, then of course the town fathers found all kinds of fault with it, that one wheel was not good and something else was at fault. And so the people in Boston, here they are. They've paid freight this far to get it to Easton. They haven't had any money. So of course they knock off another $5 and all is well. And so this was all taken care of and certain things were replaced on it. And then I found a little tiny snitch of a paper from a little notebook that had come from like a general store in the town. And it was like for the sum of $2.96. And it was to order a covering for the hearse. These selectmen were not going to just have a hearse sitting there collecting dust. And of course, they got a covering. They ordered a covering. And so I was really pleased to put that all together. And it was published. I wrote a story about this, and it was published in one of our local magazines in Maine. So I like history. I like English.
Started early on your history. What a wonderful opportunity. I can just imagine a rainy day up there with those,
Right.
those letters and treasures. So what do you remember about your school days?
Well, they were interesting in that we had two schools in town. What was called the little school consisted of the first 4 grades. Then there was the intermediary and the high school building. And downstairs in that building were grades, there were 2 big classrooms. Grades 5 and 6 were together, and 7 and 8 were together. And then upstairs, there was the high school. Now, this didn't cover everyone in the town. Easton is 6 square miles in that it was marked off just like they said to do. You draw a line on a piece of paper and every town gets 6 square miles. Some towns get to be 6 miles wide and 12 miles long because they've got 2 townships together. But basically most towns measure 6 miles by 6 miles. And so there were other little country schools that took care of the first 8 grades. And it was, and those people only came over to Easton town proper when they were going to go to high school. And so the first 4 grades, I mean, every day you'd get up, and I was too close, according to the rules of the game, to the school to ride the school bus, which of course only consisted of, it would be like a bread delivery truck. You know, I mean, there were no windows. You got in the bus and there was a slab of wood on each side and we sat facing each other. That was the type of school bus we had at that time. But anyway, I went off to the first grade in 43, I guess. And the war, of course, was on. And I started off with Ruby, forget her last name, my teacher. But halfway through the year, her husband was called up for military duty. And so she had to leave. And so then my Aunt Bessie came in. She was retired, but she came in and she was my grandmother's sister. And she came in and taught out the rest of the year. And then the next year I had Faye Adams. And so, you know, I knew all of these people, of course, who were my teachers because they lived right in the town. During the first year, I was competing, of course, with second graders. I was just a first grade. And so there was Joan Foster and Kathryn Ben. And you see, I knew these girls from Sunday school because we all went to the Methodist church, the Methodist Episcopal Church. But you see, now that I was in school, they thought they were better because they were in the second grade and I was in the first grade. So there was this little competition for a little piece of ice at the corner of the schools where the drain came down from the roof. And so we were out there for recess, and Kathryn and Joan, they were showing how well they could skate on this piece of ice that was about, 24 inches in diameter. And so then the bell rang for us to go in. Well, I was going to have my try at this 24-inch piece of ice. So I slid around, and of course I fell down. So when I went into the school, I couldn't take my jacket off because I had broken my arm. Well, now, of course, this makes it difficult for the teacher because, number one, she doesn't have a telephone in her school. But next door, there was a house that was quite handy to the school. And so I guess she left us and went over there and called my parents. And they came, of course, and took me to the hospital to get a set. And it was a bad break because it was just in the elbow. And my favorite doctor, of course, Dr. Boone, he set it, and then they x-rayed it, and it didn't hold. And so the only thing to do was to get an expert from Bangor, which is 160 miles away. It's winter. I mean, it's a difficult situation. But the doctor there, who was an orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Rulin, drove up to Prescott, where I was in the hospital, set the arm, and went back to Bangor. And I mean, when I think of the service that was given at that time, it's just amazing. But I was in the hospital probably for about a month because I had to lay flat on my back with my arm in traction in order to not move anything. And when I went home, therapy was this. Just take a pail and put some soup cans in it and have her carry the soup cans around to straighten her arm. And it worked. So sometimes the simple things are the best. But those years in the little school were interesting because, of course, then we won the Second World War. And so there was all kinds of celebrations. And if I heard that they had nylons at the general store, I ran back to tell my mother, who happened to be at the meat market, Mother, they've got nylons at the grocery store. And then, of course, new people started appearing in town. And so when I was in the 4th grade, this little girl appeared in the 3rd grade. Her name was Jeannie Kirsten. And we all looked at her and we wondered if she was a darky because her skin was so dark. Well, her father had been called up, of course, and he actually had spent a long time over at Camp Blanding during World War II, because he was an older man and he was training soldiers. So that was his permanent position primarily. And Jeannie had actually gone to P.K. Young for her first 3 years. Of course, I didn't discover that until after I moved to Florida. And we talked, and she's been here to visit me and everything that way. But anyway, we walked down the road to the town, and then down the hill. There was the Pressfield stream that ran through the area where we walked. So you walked down one hill and you were on the bridge that went across the stream. And then if I walked up another hill, I was at my home. And so that was always my little path. But anyway, Jeannie lived right on the corner in this house that had been closed up for a while. And she said to come up. And so I went up, and her mother came out, and Jeannie said, "This is Elizabeth Todd." Well, her mother just about fell apart Raymond, she called to her husband, Raymond, come here. Come here. It's Elizabeth Todd. And I thought, how do these strange people know me, you know? But of course, back when my mother and Jeannie's mother had been pregnant, they were all together at the same time. And so I went on to the kitchen, and Raymond was washing his hands underneath the faucet there, because it was essentially an oil station, Gulf Oil. And so, but anyway, that was really a surprise to me that someone would know who I was when I was a small girl. So then after fourth grade, well, we went on to the fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth. And I have wonderful memories about those, because when I was in the fifth and sixth grade, we had a teacher by the name of Winston Randall. And Winston actually boarded in a house across the road from me. And he was so innovative. I mean, I can remember one day the school superintendent came in. And of course, you expect to be on your good behavior when the school superintendent is visiting. Well, we were all down on the floor drawing a huge map of South America. And each one of us had a country that we were responsible for, whether it was Ecuador or Brazil. And we were putting that all together. And then later we mounted it on the wall. But we had, I mean, it probably was like at least 6 feet by 12. It was huge. And so we were all contentedly working away. So I guess the school superintendent was satisfied. But we were not confined to our seats. You know, we did a lot of exploratory things. We made puppet heads by taking old newspapers, soaking them in water, and forming puppet heads. We did plays. We put on a 3-act play at the local Grange Hall, which was the place for performances. And, you know, the school children came in the daytime and saw it, and then the parents came at night and saw it. And so, I mean, we were 5th and 6th graders, and we did all of that. And so, you know, it was really a good experience. Then in 49, as I finished the 6th grade, a new high school had been built in our town, and we were all brought together at that time. And so by then, they had an intermediate group of the 7th grade and the 8th grade, along with the high school, in this new high school building. And so we moved over there, and the school we'd been in became like for the 3rd and the 4th and the 5th and the 6th, and the little school became just the 1st and the 2nd grade. And so I was pleased also to have the fact that my father graduated from Easton High School in 1920. My mother graduated in 1928. I graduated in 1955. And so it's always been a joy to go back to my hometown for alumni reunions, which we have been having every 5 years, like year 2000, 2005, 2010, and was to be for this year, but it got canceled, 2020.
What would have been the population of Easton while you were growing up, with you all knowing each other so well, and sounded like a
The population
nice
was like
community.
1,600 people. They've lost population since then. Nowadays, it's down to 1,100. Financially, they do very well because they still have their own school. They have not joined in with any other town, much to the displeasure of the governor, who dictated that all these small schools should be into school districts, because they happen to have a very large French fry plant there. And they also have Huber's, which is a plywood company. So they have 2 huge companies that actually provide the tax money to run the town these days.
When you had such a good experience in school, did you think about becoming a teacher?
Yes, because of course, that's one thing you're familiar with, in that those are the people you see. And so I just wanted to do something different. So when I went to college, instead of going to the University of Maine or Colby College, my father's cousin had gone to Colby. My father had gone to the University of Maine, but I was ready to strike out and have some adventure. And so I applied to a small Methodist college in Kentucky by the name of Union College in Barberville, Kentucky. My father was a little unsure about this, but he checked with the bishop for New England, for the Methodist Church, who said, yes, it was quite all right that way. And this school had a system in which if you were valedictorian of your class, they would give you a waiver on all of your tuition. Now, of course, today that sounds very impressive. But of course, at that time, it probably amounted to $200 a semester for tuition. So, you know, it's like $400. So I picked up in 1955, got on the train in Presque Isle, Maine, and went to Barberville, Kentucky. It was a long trip, a whole 24 hours longer than I had anticipated, because Boston was a point where I had to change trains from New England to go west to Cleveland or to that area. And Boston had had a hurricane come up at that time. It had wiped out South Station. Boston consisted of 2 train stations. You could come in at North Station and you had to find your way to South Station. And so I was prepared to do that. I mean, I was fine. And I wasn't by myself in the sense that there were other young men on this train with me who were from Loring Air Force Base. Now that's a base right near my hometown in Limestone, Maine. And they were going home to visit family and friends too that way. So they got on in Presque Isle also. And so we were kind of a group all together in that, you know, we were from the far north. And then, of course, we were going on. So when we got to Boston, our plans were completely changed. And instead of leaving like at 8 o'clock in the morning, I had left Presque Isle like at 4 p.m. in the afternoon. I got into Bangor, which was where the Bangor and Aroostook Railroad ended, before midnight. Probably, I guess I was in there by 8 o'clock at least. And then at midnight, the train left and went to Boston, and got into Boston early, and I was to catch an 8 o'clock train out of Boston. But when we got in there, this 8 o'clock train from Boston had been canceled, and we couldn't get on our route until 8 o'clock that night. So that meant there was 12 whole hours we waited in Boston. And then we got on the train at 8 o'clock at night to go up to Schenectady, New York, and on to Cleveland, Ohio, down to Cincinnati, Ohio. And then when we got to Cincinnati, Ohio, it was 8 o'clock in the morning again. And again, we were just off balance enough that again, it was 8 hours to wait for the train in Cincinnati. Or it was 12 hours. So again, instead of leaving at 8 in the morning, I left at 8 o'clock at night. So 12 hours in Cincinnati waiting, and 12 hours in Boston. It was a whole day that way. But anyway, then I got to Cincinnati, and then I got the train that went down to Kentucky and made my connections there. And the last leg of the trip was on like this little tiny old train where you have a pot-bellied stove sitting in the middle of the train to keep everyone warm. And I got into the station in Barberville, Kentucky at 6 o'clock in the morning. Now, that was all right because I was aware I was getting in at 6 a.m. Only I had thought I'd get in the day before. And I had my suitcase, and I had one change of clothes in my suitcase. And I was going to go into the station, change my clothes, wait for 2 hours, and take a taxi up to the college. So I get off the train, and I'm the only one who gets off because the others are going to Hazard and Harlan in Kentucky. And the station master is there because, of course, the mail is attached to this train, and it's being picked up. And he said to me, "Are you going up to the college?" And I said, "Yes." And, of course, in my little way for an 18-year-old, but it's all right. I'll just wait here until it's 8 o'clock. "Oh, no, you don't," he said. He said, "I'm closing the station up right now as soon as I get the mail picked up." He said, "You go over there and get in that mail truck, and the driver will take you up to the college, and I'll call the dean of women." And so politely, I went over and did as he told me. I got in the mail truck with the mailman, and he delivered me to the college. And so the dean met me at the door with curlers in her hair and her bathrobe on. But anyway, I had arrived. So I won't forget that trip.
That was an amazing start. So were your college years good?
Yes, I enjoyed them there. I met a lot of nice people, a lot of people that I still correspond with. I had thought I'd go for 1 year or 2 years, and then I would transfer. But of course, as everyone knows, when you go to college and you get acquainted with people and you have friends, and I became editor of the college newspaper. And so when you get involved, you do all of those things. The college newspaper was published by the local newspaper company who published their weekly newspaper. And so we'd be down there like at midnight. And of course, it was the old machines where the lead came down. And then, of course, I'd try to proofread this. And if there's an error, the guy had to run it through again with the hot lead. And then we made it up in boxes and everything. So it was really interesting. I mean, I just can't say, I mean, it may not have been the highest rated college in the world. But sometimes there are things to be gotten from college other than just the rating of the teachers and the classes. Because I went on to Columbia after this, and many times, of course, they're highly rated. They've got outstanding instructors, but sometimes you never see them except for the classroom. And so in a small college setting, I mean, you do get to know everyone. And so I ended up spending all 4 years there. And my parents were able to drive down for my graduation in 1959. And I had won a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship to go to any college I wanted to. In that, now I think you see this is also the advantage of going to a small college. I don't remember applying for this fellowship. I think someone in the administration, either the president or some submitted names. Because when I was home for Christmas in '58, I got this call to say that I was to report to Nashville for an interview. Well, again, here I have a ride that I would meet normally in Massachusetts, and we'd all drive back together because there were a lot of students from Massachusetts. And I would just take the train or the bus to Massachusetts and meet with these people. So I had to call those people and say, I've got to go do an interview. And so I made it by hook or by crook, taking a bus to Boston, getting a plane from Boston to Cincinnati, getting in a taxi cab, realizing that to get to the bus station in Cincinnati, it was several miles from the airport. And so, I always encountered kindness of strangers. And like this man said, the bus will just stop, in this little town where there's a newspaper or something like that. And if you wait there, you can still get it. You don't have to go clear back to Cincinnati to get the bus. And so I went there and I ended up in Nashville, Tennessee. And my mother had said to me, you have to have a hat for an interview. Because, of course, that was the thing. So that morning I got up, and when I got into Nashville, of course, I had no hotel. I just walked up to a policeman and said, can you recommend a good hotel for me? Oh, yes, this one across the street is fine. He sent me over there. And so I went over there, and then the next morning I got up, and I went out, and I bought myself a little hat that would be appropriate with what clothing I had, and got myself a taxi cab and went for this interview. And when I got to the college, there was another person from Union College there, Bill Palmer, and he'd been also called for an interview. So there were two of us from the same college being interviewed for the thing. And it was a time when Castro was taking over Cuba. So there were questions about that. And I thought, I've been traveling for 3 days. I haven't had time to read the newspaper, which I guess passed all right. So then, of course, I rode back to Barberville. We went back to my hotel, and I checked out. And Bill and his family, he was a Methodist minister, and he was married, and he had 3 boys and his wife, and they were all with him. And so they, of course, took me back to Barberville, and I was able to go into the dormitory and stay that way. But anyway, I did get this Woodrow Wilson Fellowship. And of course, I want to jump from the very small to the very big. So I chose New York City, and I chose Columbia University. And so I went to Columbia, and I stayed in New York for 2 years. And that was really an enjoyable experience too. I met Phyllis Pereira, was from Ceylon, which was called at that time instead of Sri Lanka now. But, many international people, of course, at that time. And so it was very interesting. My second year, I worked in the law school at Columbia for their moot court, in that these students, of course, were all in the moot court, and they had to write their arguments and et cetera, and I would be typing those. And so Columbia was different in that you attended classes, but you got no grades for anything. It was just marked that you attended. And the only thing that counted was one exam at the very end. You either made it or you didn't make it on this one exam. And so you try to figure out what kind of questions. Well, just at that time, we were beginning the first man into space. And so Gulliver, and there was a story that Jonathan Swift had written about Gulliver going into space, etc. And lo and behold, that question was on the test. And my field was 18th century English literature. So it worked out fine. So one test and one thesis gave you a master's if you passed both of them. But otherwise, you were hanging in the wind.
But you did leave Columbia with a degree.
Yes, yes. Right.
So what were your parents' attitudes while you were going through all this? Was education a priority for them, and how did they feel about you going so far afield?
Oh, yes, my parents were, they didn't expect me to stay in Easton. And they, whatever I wanted to do, I could do. And so whether it was, Kentucky or New York City, it was fine with them that way. And then after I got my master's, I came back to the University of Maine and taught for 1 year. And then between all of that, I met Larry, because when I graduated from Union College in 1959, I had a job for the summer before I went to Columbia. I had a job in the summer at the local extension office. And Larry had finished his degree at Purdue. For his undergraduate work, he had gone to North Dakota State University. And then for his master's, he went to Purdue. And he was from northwest corner, the last county in the northwest corner of Minnesota. And so his new experience, of course, was coming to the University of Maine and working for the Extension Service. And he was essentially assigned to the area in northern Maine of Aroostook County. And so that's where our paths first crossed in the summer of 1959. And so after that, I went to Columbia for the 2 years. And then I came back to the University of Maine and I taught 1 year there. And then I felt like I ought to go back to Union College and offer my services there. So I went to Union College and taught for another 4 years. And during that time, Larry decided he wanted to pursue his doctorate. And so he took a leave of absence and went to Ohio State. And then we got married in '66. And he came back, of course, to the University of Maine to fulfill his obligation. And I came back with him then and taught for another year at the University of Maine. And then we picked up and we went to Ohio State to live because he had 2 more years in his doctorate program. And I taught at Ohio State during those 2 years. I mean, when you're graduate students, you have a very busy life. And so in Columbus, we essentially managed an apartment complex, in that when we started to look for an apartment, we found there was a need for apartment managers. This couple had bought old houses, knocked them down, built brand new apartment complexes that consisted of 3 floors. And on each floor, there was a center aisle running down, and then there were efficiency apartments. So there'd be 4 on each side. So there were 8 apartments. And so on the 3 floors, there were like 24 apartments. And so we were installed as house managers so that anyone who had questions or problems. So Larry cleaned out a good many sinks, toilets, all of those things. Our schedules worked out quite well because he went to class primarily on Tuesday and Thursday. And I had teaching assignments on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So we would switch off. I would be there on Tuesday and Thursday when he was in the classroom, and he would be there on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. But they are, it was heavy days that way. And of course, most of the apartments had been rented by the time we came. So we did not have a selection of the renters. And so football time comes, of course, and we get these rowdy people coming in, and they, bang, bang, bang. And I'd have to march down the hall. And Larry would go behind me. Of course, he wouldn't say a word, but they didn't know what he might do. So I had to be the verbal person, If you don't stop that, I'll call the police, whatever. But the next year, it was considerably easier because we had an apartment that faced the street, and these people would come up in their car and they'd get out and come in to see about an apartment. And you could tell just by their attitude towards each other, their actions in getting out of the car, whether you wanted them as a renter. And if we thought, that looks like trouble, we just wouldn't answer our door. And so that was very effective, I'll tell you, because we got some lovely people. We had Mr. Smalley, who rented an apartment, and we had some quiet individuals, you know, who were single, who were by themselves. We had a nurse who had an apartment by herself. And so that year was, the second year was much easier because we had pre-selected our renters. Oh, dear.
So what eventually brought you to Gainesville?
Well, of course, when Larry was in his last year of his doctorate, at his meetings such as the Agricultural Engineering Society, he met different people who were interested in interviewing him. And Ernie Smurden was the chairman in Florida at the Agricultural Engineering Department. That department has changed its name now, is now known as the Agricultural and Botanical Engineering Department, or Biological Engineering Department. But at that time, it was just the Agricultural Engineering Department. Ernie had arrived in Gainesville in 1968, and he was interested in building up the department. And so we were invited to come in the spring of in the spring of 69 to come for an interview. And so we flew into Gainesville at their little airport. And the Smurdens met us, and they took us to the Rights Union to stay for our duration, because at that time, the Rights Union had hotel rooms. And if you were here on business for the university, you would stay at the Rights Union. And so Larry did interviews at that time, and we liked it, and we agreed that we would come back in the fall when he had finished his degree. And so that was thus August, he finished his degree at Ohio State. And we were living in a furnished apartment in Ohio, which meant that all of our things that we did own were still stored at my mother's place in Maine. So we first moved everything from Ohio to Florida and came into Florida at that fall. I guess it was the 1st of August, or must have been about the end of August, and looked for an apartment. And at that time, we stayed overnight at the Thunderbird Motel on Southwest 13th Street. That was a very respectable hotel at that time, and that gave us a chance to look around and see what was available. And all of the new apartments that had been built at that time were on Southwest 16th Avenue. And so we found an apartment complex there that we liked and rented it. And then we turned around and went back to Maine and got the rest of our things and moved them down. So Larry officially started his job October the 1st, 1969. There were stores such as Ma's Brothers at that time. So I needed a new mattress, and we went to Ma's Brothers and ordered this mattress and gave them the address. Well, when you gave them the address of Southwest 16th Avenue, everybody would laugh because that was called Sin City in Gainesville at that time. Playboy magazine had been through just about a year before and had found that, you know, all of these new apartments were enticing the students over there to live, and they called it Sin City. And so every time you gave your address, someone would say, "Oh, Sin City." And so we stayed there for 2 years before we built a house in the west part of Gainesville. But it gave us a chance to look around and to see what was happening and to gradually work into the feel of Gainesville.
So how did you make the acquaintance of the Agricultural Women's Club?
Well, Joanne Smurden, who was Ernie's wife, was very active in the women's clubs in Gainesville, the University Women's Club and the Agricultural Women's Club. And so whenever anyone new came, she immediately took them to a meeting so that they could see what it was like. Joanne, and this was true of all of the chairmen generally, their wives provided the social mix that newcomers needed coming into Gainesville. When you're new, if you don't come and get a job, then there may not be an outlet for you to find something to do. And so this made it very good. Everybody would ask me, do you want to teach, of course? And I wanted a break, of course, from teaching. So I said no, but what I did in 1970, though, it was the year of the census. And I worked as a census taker that way to go different. In that time, you went to the doors and knocked on the doors and asked them if they got their census form filled out and everything. So that was a rather interesting project and led me into different places that I probably wouldn't have discovered otherwise. But it was good that way. And so we didn't come back until the 1st of October. And I must have missed essentially the first activities that would be for the year in September. One of the biggest ones I remember that first year was going to a Christmas party for the Agricultural Women's Club, and that was held at the Rights Union. I mean, in that year, 1970, I would guess they had probably 250 members. And essentially, even if you only had 150 attending, if they all had husbands, you've got 300 people. And so we go to the Rights Union for the Christmas party. It's not just a party, it's a dinner, it's a dance, it's a dinner dance affair. And, it's packed. So we start going around and, you see 2 empty seats and we say, is this all right? Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm saving this for a friend. Well, I can understand because, but gradually, of course, we did find a table that was free. But I mean, there were a lot of people. And from 1969, probably through 1979, I mean, those 10 years were pretty busy and pretty big as far as activities. And of course, gradually, as we worked in and got to know more people, then of course you didn't feel quite so left out as you do on that first trip through an activity zone. But there would be, every Christmas practically for first few years, there'd be this dinner dance at the Rights Union. And then there'd be fashion shows. And those were held at the Rights Union too. Larry's uncle and aunt were here in spring of 71 or maybe 72. And I know there was a big fashion show that I took the aunt to. And so there was always something to go to and to take someone to that way.
What was a fashion show like?
Well, generally it would be from one of the dress shops in town or 2 of the dress shops in town in which they would be modeling clothes that were new and coming into the fashion that way. One of the ones that took place in the 1980s was held at the Heritage Club in the Siegel building. And that was a pretty big one because essentially the club would migrate all over town into new places of meeting. And so, of course, the Sigel building came on in the 1980s, and that was the, that was the place to be. And so, essentially, the Heritage Club, Van York was a member of that, and so we could get access to the Heritage Club and have a fashion show there. And so,
Was that up at the top of this
no,
tallest building in town?
no, it was on the second floor.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So there were several meetings that were held there because, of course, we'd get our meal and whatever activity that was going on. Another place that was of interest was Ruby's. And Ruby's was located south of the Alachua County line in Marion County on US 441, because when we first came to Gainesville, Alachua County was a dry county. No liquor could be sold in Alachua County. And so if you went over to Marion County, then you could get a liquor license. And so Ruby's became very, very good place to have meetings because liquor was available at that time. So for 2 years, why parties were held at Ruby's on 441 South. and we just, new places we frequently went to enjoy, to see the decor, whatever it might be. We did casino. One time we went to the, it would be the Catholic Church on 43rd Street. We went, I guess probably Martha Wistick organized that party because she and John were members of that church. And so we used their recreational rooms or their Sunday school rooms. And we had a casino party in which we had different games that you might find at a casino set up all over the room, and plus a meal. We never went without eating, of course. So, we had a casino party. Then another party that we had over near the duck pond was a party around the world, like in 80 days. And I know people who were from the Philippines might do a dance. And we had, many of our people who were from different countries wear their native costumes. And it was an interesting party. Then we've had Christmas parties at the Thomas Center because, of course, they would always have a big tree up and it would be Christmas without decorations. You didn't have to decorate when you went to the Thomas Center. All you had to do was supply the food and the entertainment. And so that always worked out well. And so we would find ourselves in all kinds. I know the year that I was president like from 1985 to 86. We had the party at the Gainesville Women's Club for our Christmas party. And we would sometimes have the barbershop quartet come in for entertainment. And, we had a good variety of entertainment. It was a good mixture of family and friends. And it really livened up life in Gainesville by belonging to the Agricultural Women's Club.
All these food events you talked about, were the women cooking for those?
Sometimes, but sometimes it was catered also. For example, at the hotel, and that lots of times it was catered. That's why. And of course, the family picnics that they had at Lake Wahlberg, when we first came, the picnics would be on the old side of Lake Wahlberg. And then after they opened up the new section of Lake Wahlberg, the Agricultural Women's Club would meet there. But Lake Wahlberg had, from the very beginning of time, had featured as part of the entertainment for the Agricultural Women's Club. That had seemed to be always one source for a place to go and what to do.
Who was attending these parties and events? You said the husbands
Yeah,
went to some or all?
all the husbands went, like for, say, for the Christmas parties and the picnics at Lake Wahlberg. They were always husband and wife parties that went. And then when the new clubhouse was built on campus, then that became the popular spot for our Christmas party. But,
And the members of the club, were they all faculty wives, or were
yes,
there others?
basically, they were either professors on the staff or they were the wives of professors.
Women professors.
Yes.
Yeah, all women members. Yeah.
Right, right. And, you know, until they were like the University Women's Club in that they worked together and they made sure that their constitutions that they had devised for each club worked together so that they were recognized.
What was your role in the club? You said you were president.
Right. In the 80s, that's why I had worked with Barbara Warnick, and then I became president for a year. At that time, we just served 1 year. And then, of course, I was a secretary for a while. I was a courtesy chairman for a while. I just flitted from one role to another.
What did a courtesy chairman do?
Send out cards to anybody who was ill or sick or grieved, or, you know, courtesy chairman was essentially to make sure we touched base with all of those who might have a death in the family, or if they had a new baby, a card to welcome the new child. You know, it was to do that, to make sure that we had people-to-people contact, essentially.
When you joined, did you feel pressure to join?
No, because there were several others, you know, and you might join and you might just go to one meeting. And I mean, of course, dues were like $4 a year. So, I mean, you might join just so you could go to the Christmas party, you see. I mean, essentially, there was no pressure because it was there for you. It was available. If you wanted to join, that was fine. If you didn't, well, it was okay. There was never any pressure that way.
So it was a social club for women and associated others. And was there some relationship with the community beyond the membership?
Well, many times they took on a special project in that several of our members had adopted children from a child agency that they supported. And for example, at Christmas time, we might bring gifts for children that could be donated to this home. Or I think it was a Florida Children's Home, if I remember. And so then, of course, it might switch until we finally got the last 15 years or so. We decided that instead of doing it for a charity or anything, we would designate that our money went for scholarships. And that's when our emphasis on scholarships began in the 90s, essentially that way. From 1990 on, we designated scholarships for whatever money-raising opportunities we had.
And the scholarships were, who they were for?
They were for like undergraduate or graduate students, primarily graduate students in the College of Agriculture, women graduate students in the College of Agriculture.
And how was this money raised?
Well, basically it was donations, in that instead of bringing a gift for a child in an orphanage, we brought money to give to the students. In that we never had, let's say, a book sale or anything like that, really.
were you involved in the celebration of the 100th anniversary or
Yes,
the
it was.
75th? Were you here for that?
Yes.
Remember that?
Yes. Well, uh, the 100th, when the 100th occurred, which was like 1908, was it? Yes, in 1908 to 2008. Essentially, I'd been here about 40 years at that time, you see. So it was lovely. I mean, we had it at the president's house, the old president's house, I must say. Now, since it, and we had tables and everything, area set up out in the gardens. It was, if you had a nice night, it was always a beautiful place to have a party. That's one. But it was a great achievement because not many clubs managed to last 100 years. I also belonged to the Engineering Wives Club because Larry was in agricultural engineering. And so thus some of his programs were uh, overlooked by the College of Engineering. And that club lasted about 50 years. That was of course, it had not begun so early as the agricultural wives. So it lasted about 50 years. But the purpose was basically the same for the wives in the different departments to get to know each other.
So you would have been here for the 75th, which
Yeah,
was in the 1980s. What kind of celebration was that?
I can't remember.
Yeah, I wasn't. I don't remember either, actually.
Well, obviously, we didn't publish anything, you see. By the time we got to the 100th anniversary, we published the booklet and everything. So that brought everything together. And I think with the 75th, I think we just had a banquet, just a dinner
Mhm.
with remarks about, the 75th anniversary.
The booklet included a history.
Yeah.
Oh, it also had a wonderful picture that your husband had something to do with.
Yes, he volunteered to have his car, his antique Maxwell car, on display so that it would represent what I guess it was Rolf, who was the man who was pictured in some of the early pictures driving the ladies around. And so it didn't quite go back to 1908, but it was a 1916.
It sounds like some of the things you talked about, the way Gainesville was, and I'm sure the campus was much smaller and when you came, but it wouldn't in some ways have been that different. It would have been closer to 1908 than to our times now. I think
Right.
it seems those times were much simpler, and although your activities were not simple, there was all
Yeah.
kinds of
But
festivity.
by the time we arrived, uh, north northwest 8th Avenue was paved. And as I understand that in the early 60s, Northwest 8th Avenue was not paved across the swamp there. And so that was a big improvement. And of course, as everybody told me, there, there was actually a Burger King in town, and that was a pretty impressive thing in 1969. And so, if and you could ride the bus. The bus was available, and they pointed out quite a few things to me that you really have to be glad that we have these things in Gainesville. Oh dear! And
Did you feel? Did you feel any conflict between your club activities and your family responsibilities and other things that you were doing?
no, I joined a garden club in Gainesville at that time, and I've always followed the garden club too that way. In that that's been one of my primary interests, I guess. But that always came in handy doing flowers at the Agricultural Women's Club.
And many people remember those, I'm sure, those beautiful arrangements. You then you talked about how large the club was, at the point that you came in. So as a longtime member, you have watched the opposite movement toward getting smaller. How do you feel about that trajectory and where we've ended and really the demise of the club?
Well, I think it's rather sad that the women do not have more contact with people outside of their husband's particular field, in that generally you get to know the women who are married to staff members in your husband's department, but you don't get to know the women in all the other departments and all the other things that are going on. It's kind of a restriction, but I know we're living much busier lives these days. We're spending too much time on the computer and lives are busy. There's hardly the time to socialize with a great number of people. Our friendships are limited to like just small groups, it appears. And so you don't know such a wide range of people. I think that's what is missing. I mean, we were really, warmly greeted when we came to Gainesville by older people who were in the department. The Greenmans were an interesting couple. He was in economics, and he and Larry went to Guyana, British Guiana, in South America for a trip. And Mrs. Greenman was a long-time resident of Gainesville. Her parents had been here for a long time, and so she knew a lot of the history. Larry Hendricks was a botanist, and I knew his wife Willa Mae really well, and they were all like 30 years older than we were, but you got an interesting glimpse into life in Gainesville as it had been. And I don't think younger people get that these days. They just know their own contemporaries probably, and then the life that they lead in making a living. And I mean, my memories of talking about how Gainesville was in the 1950s with a lot of these people were charming and interesting, that I found. I mean, you get a better understanding of the town that way. But that's passé, that's gone away.
Can you reflect on what the original founders of the club might have thought if they could see what happened to the organization over the years?
Well, I think they would understand, in that we always have to be prepared for change, and not everything is going to last forever. And so in their circumstances, when they were trying to make wives of professors welcome to the community and have them feel included, then that was what they did. Those women were not working at all. And of course, they would just be at home unless someone reached out to them. Nowadays, our women's lives are so complex, and they're running businesses, or they've got their own trail to blaze. And so I think those women would understand that times change, and it's changed for women's clubs all over, whether they're like the Gainesville Women's Club or whether they're the Agricultural Women's Club. Times have changed.
Well said. Now, what have I missed to ask you about that you'd like to say about the Agricultural Women's Club and your experience with it?
Well, there is nothing exactly. It was just the general overall feeling of good times, good friends. When I first came to Gainesville in those 2 years in which we were looking for a house, I worked in the dean's office on campus with Dean Charlie Browning. And The head secretary at that time was Marion Hall. Marion later, about 2 or 3 years after I was president, she was president of the Agricultural Women's Club too. But Marion and I just, we clicked because we were both New Englanders. I was from Maine and Marion was from New Hampshire. And so we had a lot of good laughs together, but I worked 2 years in the dean's office. At that time, we did not, one job that I had in particular was the selection of veterinary students to go to Auburn School of Veterinary Medicine. At that time, we did not have a School of Veterinary Medicine here at Florida. And so students would make an application and Auburn would accept a certain number of students. And thus we had to go through their files, the dean and everybody, and look at these students and then suggest the ones that would get sent on to Auburn. Dean Brooker was, he no longer was dean of the College of Agriculture, but he of course had been for many, many years, and he was kind of in semi-retirement, but he had a hand in handling this veterinary project that way also. And so in a way I saw what was the past as far as how veterinary students were handled. And then of course with the building of the new School of Veterinary Medicine, how, Florida had its own, didn't have to depend on Auburn anymore. And
well,
so
you certainly have had a long experience with the University of Florida and the Agricultural Women's Club. It's very interesting. I want to bring you up to the present. And because we're in this extraordinary year of pandemic, would you care to comment on what that has meant in your life?
Well, it has simply meant that I follow directions. I wear my mask when I go out. I limit my grocery shopping to once a week, despite the fact that it takes me an hour to do it when I only go once a week. We go to our doctor and we go to the dentist when we have to. And, I'm restricted, but it's probably good because I may be able to clean up my house. And if I'm forced to stay at home and look at all my collections, maybe I could get rid of some of those collections. So I need to turn it into a good thing, you see. And I'm going to try to do that because I collect too many things. I've collected from the Agricultural Women's Club. I've collected from the Four Seasons Garden Club. I've collected Henry Dillon's papers from the 19th century. And so I need to get rid of some of these things and find a home for them.
Well, it's wonderful to be able to take a positive approach. We certainly appreciate your taking the time to do this and to add to our archives and of the Agricultural Women's Club experiences. One last opportunity, if anything else has occurred to you.
No, that's fine for today.
Okay, so I thank you again, and I will now end the recording.